Chapter 1. A forever optimist, Melinda Bain practiced the belief that if life didn't work out like she'd expected, and frequently it hadn't, she'd find a silver lining somehow. When life handed you poop, use it for compost. Now? She had this. Her poor house. The beautiful back sunroom, the space she loved the most, was gone, and with it her refuge, burnt to a state of smoking remains and scorched walls. She wasn't sure how to spin the loss into something positive. If that was even possible. After moving back home 10 years ago to buy into her family's diner, Melinda had driven by the 1930s Craftsman, fallen instantly in love, and bought it. The first act of her much-needed life do-over. Something about the quaint neighborhood with the picket fences had said home, and the purchase had rejuvenated her. Melinda had found her footing and left her two ex-husbands and her impulsively made poor decision life firmly behind her. The fire's out, but you're gonna need to tarp the area, at a minimum. Sean the fireman was tall, but then most guys were tall to her since she barely reached 5'3" in her stocking feet. She had to focus on his mouth in order to process what he was saying. She nodded, looked away toward the horizon, noticed light was creeping into the dark sky, and made herself count to 50. Maybe the fire was a sign. Maybe she was going about things all wrong once again. She would not cry. She would not cry. Her lawn was soaked from the fire hose, and the chill of the water seeped into her slippers. The pungent aroma of charred wood permeated her senses, and Melinda wasn't sure if it was the smell, the ruined room, or the loss of her dream that made her want to empty her stomach into the host of plants she had placed along her property line. Every dime she'd saved for the last 5 months was likely going to go into repairing her house. She rubbed her empty womb and felt the impact of the fire at her very core. 2 failed attempts at intrauterine insemination had been demoralizing, each with a depression that had lasted for weeks. But the loss of this third attempt was going to set her for months emotionally, and the fire would do the same financially. Melinda swallowed the lump in her throat, then sucked in a ragged breath. All those additional hours at the diner, cutting out cable TV, sacrificing little extras like going to the movies, dinner out, or buying new clothes, and foregoing her monthly facials had been easy when she'd first started down this path. For nearly 2 years, she hadn't had a vacation that went beyond reading a book in her backyard hammock, a day at Clearwater Beach, or swimming in her parents' pool. But lack of success was wearing on her, and even though time away would do her wonders, that wasn't about to happen. More sacrifice was in her future. "You're lucky we got here before it caught the rest of the house on fire," Fireman Sean said, shifting uncomfortably. "As it is, the back wall will likely need to be replaced." He offered her a blanket. "Yes, lucky. That's me." If by luck he meant bad, she'd believe that. Good luck would have been her putting the fire out with the large pan of water she'd splashed on it, as soon as her brain processed what was happening. She shook her head, refusing the blanket, crossed her arms over her chest, and tried to chase the chills of loss away by rubbing her upper arms. "You're insured, right? It should cover this." He indicated to the empty space where her sunroom used to be, and a large gaping hole. In the house's original state, the opening had been the back door, but was now an invitation for the out-of-doors to come on in. She nodded. Yes, it would be covered, but insurance was slow, and initially she'd be on the hook for retainers and other costs, forcing her to spend her make-her-dreams-come-true money earmarked for the clinic next Friday. Her small emergency stash wouldn't even cover a fraction of what she would need to fix this disaster. Either way, her plans had just come to a screeching halt. Normally one to seize life by the belt and drag it behind her, Melinda felt as if she'd taken a hit to the chest. One day, she was going to stop being so optimistic. Stop believing that she might have a say in how her life played out, that something might go her way because today life kicked her in the balls. Fireman Sean tapped his helmet against his leg. "Are you gonna be all right here, Melinda? Can I call your mom and dad for you? I hate seeing you like this." How long had she known him? Since kindergarten for sure, maybe even before that. If memory served, she'd spent 7 minutes in heaven with him at one of his famous parties in high school. "How are your kids?" "Fine. A handful. Crazy how opposite they are. Thanks, by the way, for scoring those Comic-Con tickets. You made my little Star Wars fan a happy guy that weekend." Melinda shrugged. It had been a no-brainer to pass along the tickets someone had given her. She had no interest in the event, but knew Sean's youngest son did because that was all he talked about when she'd see him at the diner. "But I was asking about you. You don't look so good." "I'm okay. I'll call my—" "Holy hell, Melly. I don't know if I brought enough tarps." Melinda turned and through the glow cast from the neighbor's porch light and beams from the fire truck watched Jared Calhoun cross her yard. "What? How?" She squinted her eyes at him. "What are you, construction's version of an ambulance chaser?" Jared laughed. "I'm a volunteer firefighter. You know that. I heard it on the scanner and recognized the address." "Sean." He held out his hand to the tall fireman. "Jared, you got this under control?" Jared pulled a hammer from his back pocket, flipped it over before catching it with one hand. "I can get it tarped before the sun is fully up." He turned to Melinda. "But I'd worked faster if I had some coffee." She stared at the smoldering building. The parallel to how her dreams had just gone up in smoke nearly caused her to burst out in laughter. Her emotions were on a spin cycle, and in seconds, she went from being simultaneously angry and sad to being bitter and desperate. She couldn't get sucked into the negative what-ifs. She needed to pull strength from her reserves and focus. This was only a setback. Her baby goal was certainly worth all the sacrifices and would continue to be. "Melinda?" Jared said. "What?" She looked at him and blinked away her pensiveness. "Yes, coffee." "Okay." She turned to the fireman. "Thanks, Sean. Tell the family hi." She cinched the belt on her pink silk robe and began the walk to the front of her house, her matching silk pink mule slippers sinking into the wet earth with each step. By the time she stepped onto the porch of her beloved traitorous house, the fur trim on her slippers was matted and drooping, much like her spirits. Once inside her foyer, she slipped off her mules and tread the rest of the way in her bare feet. From the sanctuary of her kitchen, she could almost pretend that everything was as it should be. Almost, but the acrid residual smoke made her eyes water, and, as she leaned over her sink and looked out through the window at the brightening sky, blinking back tears, she considered bailing. Moving to another city or state, and starting over. Maybe this was the universe's way of threatening her, telling her to get out. She'd long come to terms with being unlucky in love. She'd given it her best shot repeatedly, and had finally looked past the idea of Mr. Right, 2.5 kids and a dog. She had the house with a picket fence, but now with a burned backside, and the irony of that made her laugh out loud. She shook her head, refusing to give in to such internal histrionics. She'd had plenty of setbacks before. Today would be no different. She'd get past it and somehow figure out a way to keep to her plan. Hopefully. Because any other option would simply not do. "No, sir." The banging of Jared's hammer echoing through her house caused her to jump. Pulling herself from her pity party, she brushed her eyes with her sleeve, then turned to fill her electric teapot before setting it to boil. On autopilot, she measured out the scoops of coffee for her French press and poured scalding water into it, all while forcing her head back in the game and trying to construct some sort of contingency plan. She'd have to cancel her appointment, and though she could now predict her ovulation to within a day, stress was going to play havoc with her cycle. She couldn't assume it would be as predictable as it currently was. Melinda groaned in dread. She was back to taking her daily temperature, a task she'd long come to believe a necessary evil. If she had to wait for a third try, she needed to ensure the margin of error of around her ovulation cycle was next to none. She couldn't afford to lose the opportunity over complacency. She set 2 mugs on the counter and checked the coffee. To pass the remaining minutes of brew time, she called her father to tell him she wouldn't be in and why. After at least 50 "No, I don't need your help," she went into her office to find her policy and the company's number. A long-term pro at self-sufficiency, Melinda inhaled a deep breath through her nose and exhaled it slowly through her mouth, squared her shoulders, and shuddered back the tremors that were threatening to overcome her. After calling in the fire to the claims department, she poured the coffee, added creamer to Jared's, and turned to take it to him, only to find him standing in the kitchen doorway staring at her feet. "That should hold you for now, but I don't like that you're exposed. I'll send a crew out as soon as I can to get a temporary door in place, so you can lock yourself in the house." He reached for the mug. Dark smudges of soot were on his hands and face. The knees of his pants were damp, and his hammer hung from a belt loop. "Thanks," she said. He rubbed a hand over his shaven head, leaving a streak of soot in its wake. Here. He pulled out a chair from her small kitchen table. You need to sit. You're in shock. I'm okay. Your eyes are bigger than the mug you're holding, and you're pale. Really pale. Sit. Jared. Sit. He pushed the chair closer to her. You can yell at me all you want, but not until you sit. On a huff, she plopped into the chair and promptly burst into tears. Hey. He put his coffee cup on the floor, took hers and placed it next to his, then squatted in front of her. It's all fixable. Insurance will replace everything. What's important here is that you're safe, and once I get a temporary door on there, you'll be even safer. You're lucky you caught it in time. Crouching beside her, they were eye to eye, and he wrapped his arms around her. She rested her head on his shoulder. I was awake. I'm sorry, what? He stroked her hair and Melinda closed her eyes. I was awake. It sparked from the outlet and traveled up the wall. I tried to put it out, but I couldn't get water to it fast enough. You don't have a fire extinguisher? His voice was low and soothing, but that didn't stop her from becoming defensive. She pushed against him and straightened up. No, Jared. I do not have a fire extinguisher. But you can be assured that I will have one from now on. Hey, I'm not faulting you. If I had known you didn't have one, I would have got one for you. It's not your job to take care of me. I take care of me. She used the heel of her hand to wipe her tears. The last thing she wanted was to become dependent on him more than she already was. Over the last 10 years, he'd slowly become a greater part of her life, their friendship cementing with time. The number of guys she dated had dwindled, and her time with Jared had increased so much these past 2 years he'd become a staple in her life. She enjoyed the days when he came into the diner for breakfast, or popped over on Wednesdays with takeout after his builder's meeting. Looked forward to them, actually. She missed him when she didn't see him, and if he started buying her safety equipment and doing husbandly things like checking her tires, she'd be in a heap of trouble. One day he might be someone else's husband, and then where would she be? Melinda, when are you gonna realize that I'm here to help? Your family. I was married to your brother for 43 days over 14 years ago. We were stupid kids. That doesn't make me family. But once a Calhoun, always a Calhoun. Stupid man. With stupid words that twisted in her heart. If he called her family one more time, she was going to hit him where it hurt. She sighed with exhaustion. I appreciate you coming by, Jared. The insurance people are sending someone in a few hours, so I guess I should get ready. She leaned against the back of the chair. Jared rolled back on his heels, sat on the floor, stretching his long legs before him, and picked up his mug. I'll wait here while you shower and get ready. I'm not okay with you doing those things with a tarp as your only barrier. You really don't have to. Yes, I do. Now go. You mind if I make something to eat? I'm starved. Melinda shook her head and eased out of the chair. She stepped over his legs and walked as quickly as she could to her room to grab clothes. After closing herself off in the bathroom, she turned on the shower, then sat on the floor and waited for the water to get hot. Sucking in deep breaths, she forced back her tears. Living with regret was inevitable if one chose to actually live their life, and Melinda had done just that. She made no apologies for it. But if she could undo one thing, just one, it would be her marriage to Jared's younger brother Lance. Not because she regretted her time with him. No, they were both young and stupid and caught up in the moment of thinking they knew it all and deserved the world. She would undo it because, more than anything, she wanted a nice guy to share her life with. And the nice guy she'd come to picture was the one that had knelt before her, rubbed her back, talked about buying her a fire extinguisher, and called her family. Chapter 2. Stunned, Melinda stared at the insurance guy. But I had the house inspected before I bought it, and they said the electrical was all to code. I'm sorry, but not all of it is. Looks like this room was built without a permit, and the wiring was piggybacked onto the old system. Not to code at all. If they did that here, then any other room that was remodeled by them is likely at risk as well. She looked toward the updated kitchen and laundry room add-on that had been so appealing when she purchased it, but now might spark a fire at any moment. What do you suggest? Getting a contractor in here as soon as you can to get it fixed. I have to put it in our files that you have faulty wiring. Send in the proof of permits and work, and we'll update everything. He ripped off a check from his pad. Here, this should help get you started. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. She took the check. I understand. You're only doing your job. With a handshake, they ended the meeting. Processing what he'd told her, Melinda watched the insurance man walk away. With the check flapping lightly in the breeze, she wondered if she should let the place burn down if it were to light up again. Start over. Get something newly built. It would be far easier than tackling this obstacle. Melinda wanted to kick herself. It was that mentality that had ruled most of her 20s and led to poor relationship decisions. Starting over might seem easier, but the payback was always twofold, and she wasn't getting any younger. Her baby-having days were limited as they were. Starting over would only postpone that further. A crew of 3 guys snapped her out of her reverie when they came around the corner. Hey Melinda, called Keith, Jared's youngest brother. Hey Keith. What are you doing here? She opened her arms and pulled him into a hug. She'd always liked Keith, whose childlike mind managed to stay innocent no matter how old he got. I'm helping the crew today. I'm the supply runner. He showed her where a variety of tools hung from his belt. Sounds like a busy day for you then. Jared said for you not to worry. We'll get you fixed up real good. I have no doubt, Keith. No doubt. She squeezed his arm, then glanced at her watch. Hey, would you mind keeping an eye on things? I'm going to take this check to the bank. Sure thing, Melly. We'll make sure everything is locked up tight when we leave. Thanks. She leaned in, kissed his cheek, then chuckled when she saw the hint of a blush follow. She made good time to the bank and decided to swing by her diner's competitor, 2 Chicks and Bacon, for a cup of coffee. Sure, she could get a mug at her place, but then she'd have to deal with her father and his cronies that hung out there. At Lorelei and Andy's diner, she might actually have a moment of peace. Besides, they closed in a couple hours and their traffic should be decreasing, whereas at her place the lunch crowd would be coming in. She pulled into the lot and took a moment to admire the cute gingham awning and the way the logo was painted on the large picture window. If Melinda were solely in charge of their diner, it would be cute like this. Where Lorelei's place was boutique in nature, Melinda's was most decidedly a greasy spoon, a quality money-earning greasy spoon that embodied the concept of diner in every sense of the word. She took a seat at the counter and waited for someone to notice her. Coming here was not a custom of hers. Like all diners, 2 Chicks and Bacon had their regulars. Many were friends of the owners. Should I be worried that you're here? Lorelei asked as she leaned against the counter. Her baby bump was the first thing Melinda noticed. No, I just need a good cup of coffee and a quiet moment. Melinda flipped her hair over her shoulder and then pulled out a menu. And maybe something to eat, come to think of it. She hadn't eaten all day, and her day had started before the crack of dawn. I heard about your house. I'm sorry. Breakfast on me, Lorelei said. What? No. You don't have. I know I don't have to, Melinda, but you've had a shitty day, and I want to. Lorelei's look dared her to protest. For the second time, the first being when Jared hugged her, she felt the tightness in her chest ease. Thanks. I'd love some blueberry pancakes. She put the menu back in the holder. Heavy comfort food might help ease her anxiety and tilt the balance back toward her status quo. Watch out, boys, she'll chew you up. She's a man-eater, Andy sung as she came around the counter. Oh, hi, Melinda. I didn't see you there. It wasn't the first time people, usually girls, sang the Hall and Oates song around her. She knew people called her a man-eater behind her back, that and a host of other things. Melinda wanted to tell them all their gossip-mongering only added more intrigue to her reputation, and contrary to popular belief, she'd never fooled around with a married man or even entertained the notion, never broke up a marriage, and no man had ever died while keeping company with her. Give it a rest, Andy. She's already been kicked in the face once today, Lorelei said. Oh man, sorry, Melinda. I forgot about the fire. I just hold it against me that I kissed Buck once back in high school? Buck was Andy's husband. Andy laughed and poured Melinda a cup of coffee. No, girl. I should thank you for that, actually, because once you were done with him, he kissed better. Of course, I taught him everything else he knows. Andy laughed again. I just like teasing you like I do everyone else. She didn't know if being teased about her reputation was a compliment, but the fact that Andy was treating her like she did all her other friends spoke volumes. Andy and Lorelai had been friends since they were in diapers and hung in a tightly knit, closed-off circle. Even the hint of being considered part of their fold blew Melinda's mind. Andy leaned across the counter. Can I ask for a favor? Her voice was a whisper, and her eyes darted around the room. Melinda leaned forward as well. I'll admit that I'm nervous to hear about this so-called favor, but damn if I'm not curious. Andy's lips twitched with a smile. I need some help with women stuff. Please tell me we aren't having the period talk. Andy smacked her on the side of the arm. I need help with the art of conversation? Seduction, Andy whispered, and sweat broke out above her brow. Melinda sat back stunned. A second later she leaned forward again, her brain racing. Andy. You're beautiful. I can't think of a single thing I could show you that would make any improvement. Andy smiled and played with her fingernails. You walk into a room and people stop and look. I've seen you make grown men blush, and not from embarrassment but the sincerity in your flattery, and I don't think I can learn any of that in this lifetime, but maybe if you help me pick out some clothes, taught me a few things about how to wear them, I might, be able to apply them in a constructive manner. Are we talking about Buck here? Applying these new things to your husband? I know it's not any of my business, but... Of course we're talking about Buck. What kind of woman do you think I am? Melinda stared at her, one brow arched, and bit her cheek to keep from smiling. Sorry? I guess I did kinda set it up wrong, Andy said. Kinda. She toyed with the handle on her coffee cup, waiting for Andy to continue. Listen, you're really good with clothes. You have really big. She pointed to Melinda's chest. Boobies. So do you. Melinda pointed back. But they're hidden under this tent of a shirt. She tugged at Andy's oversized peasant shirt. I know, and I think that's part of the problem. We've been together 17 years, married 10, and he doesn't look at me like he used to. I figured since Bucky really likes my, I could start there. Melinda laughed. They're breasts, honey. Boobies. Tits. It's okay to say it. We're grown women and they're a part of who we are. Andy's cheeks were pink. So are you in? Why don't you ask Lorelai? She is your BFF. Andy rolled her eyes. Please. I want to va-va-voo my wardrobe, not turn it into beach bum wear. That girl has more pairs of capris than should be legal. Call me crazy, but I don't think capris sex me up. Melinda laughed. She wasn't a capri girl either. Melinda looked around the diner, uncertainty giving her pause. She might have known Andy most all her life, but they weren't part of the same crowd. What? Afraid to be seen with me or something? Not cool enough for you? Melinda snapped her eyes back to Andy. Are you kidding? What will people say about the two of us suddenly hanging out and shopping? Andy pursed her lips. With an arched brow she said, likely they'll say nothing, but wouldn't it be cool if they said we're having a secret affair? Oh wait, maybe they'd say you, Buck, and I were, having one of them menage a trois. That would be awesome. No one ever says anything exciting about me. Melinda smiled. I'm not going to teach you to dress like me. She flipped her hair over her shoulder in an exaggerated gesture and ran her hand down her wine-colored wrap shirt. Only I can pull that off, but I can help you find things that'll make you feel good about yourself, not uncomfortable if someone other than Buck looks at you. Which will happen, I assure you. She winked. Yeah, I can definitely help you draw Buck's attention. Andy pushed back from the counter and clasped her hands together in delight. Can you go this weekend? Sure, unless something with the fire hangs me up. Great. Thanks, Melinda. I'll drive. I have a big truck, so there'll be plenty of room for us, our big boobies, and your ego. Melinda laughed and waved her away. Go away so I can eat my food in peace. She used her haughtiest tone while watching Lorelei deliver her pancakes. Melinda swirled the butter around the top pancake, letting it soak in before she poured on a healthy serving of maple syrup. Just as she was about to dig in, the diner door swung open and in walked Jared. He didn't see her at first and called out greetings to Lorelei and Andy. He was about to slide into the seat 3 places down when he noticed her. Ah. He straightened back up. What are you doing here? She smiled, knowing she had him trapped. I came to check on you. But Andy had already filled a mug of coffee for him and placed the creamer next to it. She knew how he drank it. I believe I'll call bullcrap on that. Question is, why are you here? Don't you own a diner down the way? I can go wherever I please. So can I. So much for the whole "we're family" nonsense you were talking about this morning. If I went to another construction company, you'd lose your mind. Briefly, Jared hung his head. When he looked back at her, his eyes twinkled. Would you buy that I believe in supporting small businesses? She wanted to continue with the ribbing, but to be honest, the mood was gone. Who was this guy that hung out at Lorelei's diner? How often did he come? Enough that Andy knew how he liked his coffee. Everything she thought she knew about Jared suddenly seemed wrong. Yes, being upset with him was stupid and unreasonable. He wasn't hers. He wasn't hiding a secret life or anything. Yet when she looked into his laughing green eyes, it was obvious she'd been naive where Jared was concerned. She'd been a fool to believe she was a large part of his life like he was hers. She wanted to bang her head on the counter for being so stupid to think she knew all of Jared. That the times he'd come around her house or the diner or the Sunday dinners she still shared with his family was the sum of his life. It doesn't matter. I'm just giving you a hard time. She turned the conversation back to business. When I left this morning, your brother and a few other guys were fixing the door to the house. Thanks. He slid into the seat next to hers and turned to face her, his hand resting on his upper thigh. I'll come by later to make sure it meets my standard. Did the insurance guy come already? She nodded. Apparently the back room was wired improperly, and so it's likely the other rooms that were updated were as well. Jared gave a low whistle. I'll get my electrician out there at the latest tomorrow. He'll figure it out, and then we'll know what to do. Melinda could only stare at him, words of disapproval stuck in her throat. She simultaneously loved and hated it when he used the plural we when referring to her life. She wanted him to stop, but couldn't bear to tell him that. That's if you want my company to do the work. I'm giving you a good deal since you're family and all. But I can respect your need to get a second opinion. She shook her head. I'm good. It was such a relief not to have to juggle the construction aspect as well. She'd held off canceling her intrauterine insemination appointment in hopes that something might go her way, and coping with that alone was taking all she had. Good. You should eat those hotcakes before they get cold. He plucked a berry off the stack and tossed it in his mouth. Thanks, Jared, she said, tears threatening to break free. He moved his arm to rest along the back of her chair and leaned over, placing a soft kiss on her temple. I got your back, Melly. Let me take care of you. Lord knows she wanted to lean into him and let him carry the burden. Even for a small amount of time. But her head told her heart to stop being so foolish. That depending on him made her weak and gave people the wrong idea about them. The last thing she wanted was for the gossips to natter on about her going through the sons of the Calhoun clan. Jared, or Keith for that matter, didn't deserve to be talked about like that simply because they were friends with her. Reeling from it all, afraid her need for him and desire to be rescued was written across her face, Melinda asked for a box for her food. You leaving so soon? Andy asked as she loaded the pancakes into a container. Melinda nodded. I have a lot to do. Call me about this weekend, Andy. Sure thing, hun. Andy said with a wink. Lorelei made a to-go bag for you already. Andy placed the container into a cute brown sack with rope handles and handed it over. Melinda peered into the bag loaded with a plethora of comfort found in bakery items. Hey. You all right? Jared grabbed her hand. She looked at his hand covering hers and gave his a squeeze. I'll see you tomorrow. She slid her hand from his and left the diner. With nowhere else to go, she was forced to head home and face her current crisis once again. As she inspected the makeshift back door, the soot-covered back wall of her house, and the water damage, it took every bit of discipline not to eat the entire contents of the bag Lorelei had sent with her. Chances were high she'd follow up the binging with a good cry and end it by rocking in a ball. Instead, she pressed a fresh batch of white coffee shipped from the Pacific Northwest, turned it into an iced delight, and curled up on her porch swing with a good book. She didn't want to go inside and turn on a light, afraid she'd ignite another fire. She didn't want to think about everything that needed to be done, or Jared's offer to help. In all her days, the highs and lows of marriages and breakups, she'd never felt as alone as she did at this moment. Yes, she had her parents, and even Jared's parents, but she didn't have that one person who would hold her when the sun went down and love away her fears. Woman, and this was the best opportunity to show her she could count on him. Never mind he had bids to finish, or that he was balls tired and had been looking forward to watching a game on TV. Nope, if there was even the slightest chance he might get Melinda to see him as something other than Lance's brother, he was going to take it. He'd always had a predilection for blonde buxom bombshells, and Melinda was no different. Oh hell, who was he kidding? His affinity was for Melinda only, all the others were just poor imitations. Jared pulled his truck along the curb a few houses down from Melinda's and watched her sit in the fading sun staring out at nothing. Thankful he'd had the wherewithal to assemble a game plan of sorts, he'd managed to interrupt his mad drive over with a stop at a Chinese takeout. Grabbing the bags of food and a fire extinguisher he'd picked up earlier, he then made his way to her porch. You do know that you can turn on the lights? The house isn't going to explode. He rested one foot on the first step and hoped she'd hear the jesting in his voice. She didn't startle, just swung her weary gaze to him. You don't know that. I thought the same thing last night when I turned on the light to the sunroom and sparks shot out of the outlet. I brought protection. He held up the extinguisher. Come on, let's go live dangerously. That's not funny. This is my house, Jared. I don't want it to burn down. She didn't even raise her voice. The fight in her was gone, and that's when Jared realized things were worse than he had thought. Emotional toughness was a part of who she was. Determination was what he'd come to expect from her and admired. Hell, it was one of the things he loved about her. Melinda, if you want, I can turn off some of the lines that feed into the part of the house you're worried about. My gut would be the laundry room and maybe your bathroom. But you've got enough natural light in the day to not need it, and tonight we can set up battery-operated lights to get you by. My electrician will be here tomorrow to get to the bottom of it. Would you please? I'd feel better. He nodded and climbed up on the porch. Here, feel like some food? You can get this set up while I take a look at the fuse box. She jumped up and smiled. Thanks. It took less than 5 minutes to power off her areas of concerns, and when he came into the dining room, she'd set the table with small hurricane lamps, dishes, and the food. You're okay with candles? Open fire. He gestured to the lamps. Yeah, I feel like I can control those. Want a beer? She was smiling, and he was immensely pleased he had something to do with that. Sure. Have a seat, she called from the kitchen. She came back into the dining room carrying 2 beers in each hand. She set all but one down, twisted off its top, and handed it to him. Damn, she turned him on. Had since the first day he'd laid eyes on her in high school. Then his fool-ass brother had to get his hands on her, initially to piss Jared off, but then Lance had realized she was the right sort of accessory, a pretty girl and a hard worker, and he needed both of those to support his Hollywood dream. I didn't realize I was hungry until I started putting this out. It smells so good. Thanks for bringing it. She plopped into a chair, pulled herself up to the table and crossed her legs Indian style. With a sigh of pleasure, she reached for the first carton. Jared took a swig of his beer and tried to keep his eyes from wandering to her legs or the way the seat cupped her cute ass. He was overcome with a strong need to place a languid kiss there. Heat flooded his body, as desire fought with common sense for control of his decision-making skills. He knew he couldn't kiss her, but man oh man, he really wanted to. I have to wash my hands. He stepped toward the hallway. Did you turn that fuse off? She asked over her shoulder, dumping sticky rice onto a plate. Yeah. It'll be dark in there. There's a flashlight in the cabinet below the sink. Right side. She dipped a spring roll into sweet and sour sauce. Jared found the flashlight, then closed the door behind him. He stood staring at his reflection, the limited light accentuating the bags under his eyes. His desire to be around her was growing each day. He loved her more today than yesterday, and the frustration of having to balance their friendship with what he really wanted was keeping him awake at night. The subtle yet dull throb in his temples told him a headache was coming on. All this repression was going to give him a stroke. Opening the medicine cabinet, he searched for aspirin. His heart skipped a beat as he read the label on the second largest bottle. Prenatal. They weren't the store-bought ones either. These were prescription. All the air in the room went still as a chill of dread ran down his spine. Jared racked his brain trying to remember if he'd seen Melinda out with anyone, or if she'd mentioned any dates. Whoever he was, Jared would kill him. The question was, slowly or quickly. Why wasn't he here? Why wasn't he in her life? Maybe he didn't exist. Maybe she wasn't pregnant and taking the vitamins because that was something women did. Jared smiled and almost laughed out loud with relief. That had to be the answer. Never mind how moody she'd been. He could attribute that to the fire, and rightly so. For good measure, he decided to look in the bottom cabinet. He didn't know what he'd find, but a reassurance that his assumptions were accurate would be nice. A giant box of those tampon things would go a long way. Tucked behind a roll of toilet paper was a book about the 40 weeks of pregnancy and life after delivery. Jared sat on the floor and stared at the picture of a baby in the womb. He placed the book back in the cabinet next to an ovulation kit and closed the cabinet doors. He definitely needed the aspirin now. After he used the counter's edge to pull himself up, he had to lean against it to wrestle off the childproof cap. After dumping 2 tablets in his hand, he placed the bottle back on the shelf while simultaneously knocking a thermometer off. Putting the thermometer back, he closed his eyes, refusing to see anymore. He tossed the pills into his mouth and swallowed them dry, then turned off the flashlight and placed it on the counter. With no light to guide him, he felt his way out of the bathroom, staggering into the light like a man who'd been in the dark far too long. Melinda was shoveling food into her mouth, pausing only to take a swig of beer. I know you like to live on the edge, challenge life, but don't you think drinking is taking it too far? He walked up to the table and snatched the beer from her hand. Hey! What in the hell? What are you talking about? You have someone else to consider now. Confused, she looked around. The baby, Melinda. The baby. Do you really think you should be drinking while you're pregnant? He slid into the dining chair next to her and took a long pull from her beer, finishing it off. Jared. Whose is it? Why isn't he coming around? He put her empty bottle on the table, then reached for his. He tossed it back, finishing it in 3 swallows. His gaze wandered to the 2 unopened bottles she had brought out earlier. I'm not pregnant. She reached for a bottle and twisted off the top. But I want to be. She took a long swallow, her eyes still on him. Jared's mind raced, dividing her remark into manageable bite-sized pieces. It made sense she'd want a baby, most of their friends were having them. But he still couldn't figure out all the logistics. You got someone special on the hook that you're wanting to be the father of this baby? This was what he really wanted to know, needed to know. She sat back in her chair and snorted with what sounded like disgust. Don't be such a knuckle-dragger. Yep, it was disgust. I don't need someone special to have a baby. Melinda. I can have a baby all by myself. Well, maybe science has changed since we were in school, but last I knew, you needed a man to contribute to the process. Exactly. Contribute, yes. Be present. Nope. Jared was shaken. Are you saying? She leaned forward in her chair and put the bottle on the table. With both her hands free, she took the empty bottle from him, set it aside, and then cupped his hands in hers. I know I've shocked you. That's why I haven't said anything. But I'm talking about intrauterine insemination. I bought sperm from a bank. Melly. He wanted to cover his ears, make her stop talking. It's hard for someone like you, Mr. Tradition, to wrap your mind around someone purposefully being a single parent, especially when you come from a family like yours. What's that supposed to mean? And what does it have to do with this? He was pretty sure she'd just insulted him. You know, your mom has always been a stay-at-home mom. Doesn't she still do your laundry? No. He pulled his hands from hers, then crossed his arms. Truth was, she sometimes did. What I'm saying is that you don't know anything other than having two parents. One that worked all the time and one that was home all the time. In my situation, I'm purposefully assuming the role of both those people. That's something I'm sure doesn't align with your traditional values. Wow, that's the second time tonight you've referred to me as primitive. You come from the same type of family. How are your parents handling this? Or haven't you told them either? She laughed and the grip on his hand eased. Funny enough, my mama's torn between being appalled and overjoyed at potentially having a grandchild. I think the grandchild idea is tipping the scales because last week she emailed me an article about food that helps fertility. I don't know what to say. He searched her face. The vixen that he'd always associated her with being, a man's temptress, was not staring back at him. Instead, he saw a pleading earnestness in her expression, her beautiful face soft and vulnerable. Maybe even a little uncertain, and Melinda had always been all things confident. Say that you understand. That you'll still be friends with me when I'm cranky because I'm hugely pregnant or overly tired. You don't want to go about this in the typical way? He tried to ask the question as delicately as he could, without getting called a Neanderthal again. Yes, because I've been so successful at marriage in the past. I've tried the traditional route. I've dated so much that the folks of this town call me all kinds of names, and you know I'm right. What's the latest? That I'm a black widow. Any guy who stops and talks to me is having an affair with me. Women don't talk to me. There's no one in this stupid-ass town left for me to date. 1,000 remarks threatened to escape, but the one repeating on loop in his head was she hadn't dated every guy in this stupid-ass town. She'd overlooked him. What about other towns? Orlando? Tampa? I've been on all the online dating sites. I've kissed more toads who stayed toads than I care to count. They stereotype me based on my looks. Think I'm vapid and without brain cells. That I don't know all those accidental brushings of their hands against my breast isn't their cheap shot of trying to feel me up. I've never been one to let life happen to me, and I'm not about to start now. But this is a baby. Yeah, I'm starting my own family. Plenty of women do it, and I aim to be one of them. Can't you understand or try to understand where I'm coming from? Why does it matter if I do or not? She answered without hesitation. Because you're my friend. Your opinion means a lot to me. Removing his hands from hers, he stood and looked around the room, his eyes settling on Melinda. His friend. Horseshit. It was all horseshit. They had a friendship built on what exactly? What would she think if she knew he came around because he was looking for something from her, and it wasn't freaking friendship? Jared scrubbed his hands down his face, the dull thud of his headache replaced by a louder pulsing, stabbing pain. I should go. She gave him a doe-like blink. Okay. I'm going to check the back door first. He shuffled out of the dining room and made his way in the dark to the back of the house. Melinda followed. I feel stupid being intentionally in the dark. Yeah, I know what you mean, he mumbled. Jared. He swung to face her. I think you need to wait a bit and think it through some. What if the kid has needs like Keith? That hasn't been easy on my folks, you know. She shrugged. Then I'll do the best I can. It would be no different if I had a baby and the dad took off. That happens too. I wish you'd wait. Your wish has been granted. The money I was going to use will now have to go to getting these repairs started. But insurance should cover it. Insurance will piecemeal the payouts and cover the fire. Not the electrical. That pushes back my baby getting plan until this project is done. She sounded very close to tears. Jared checked the durability of the door and the security of the lock. His crew had done a good job. This will hold. It's not a long-term solution, but I'll take another look in the daylight. Maybe we can make it work for a while so you don't have to postpone anything. He couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. Hadn't he just asked her to give it more thought? Now he was an enabler. He shook his head in disgust. His love for her was the bane of his common sense. I can only hope. She pressed her hands together, as if attempting to contain her optimism. I'll see ya in the morning, he said, and waited for her to precede him to the front of the house. What about the food you brought? Her flashlight lit up the dark hallway, but once in the front room the brightness of the lamps made him squint. I'm good. Mainly, I wanted to make sure that you were doing okay, and that the door was safe enough. I've done that. I'll see you in the morning. He gave her a nod and turned to leave, tripping over one of her ruined mule slippers. This woman with her flaxen hair, heart-shaped mouth, and hourglass figure who haunted his dreams had now just blown his mind with her desires for hearth and home. Not that he was surprised by that. Quite the opposite, in fact. He just thought perhaps he would have more time to make her see she might want those things with him. Clearly, he'd never even been a consideration. Chapter 4. She awoke early, having tossed and turned through most of the night, her conversation with Jared on a loop. Determined not to read into anything he said, she decided that any likely all his reactions had been based on shock. The idea that a chance, albeit a small one, might exist, and she could achieve her targeted plans filled her with new energy. She didn't care that she had showered in the dark or had blown her hair dry in the foyer using her hall mirror. She had hope. She arrived at the diner as her dad was setting up the tables and Chuck, the short-order cook, was prepping the kitchen. Hey darling, her dad Bert called as she stored her purse in a cabinet in the kitchen. Hey Pops. She kissed his cheek, then took the large salt box from him and moved to the next table to continue his work. Stopped by yesterday and saw the damage? We're telling your mama it was a small electrical fire that was contained to one area, so she won't worry. That's basically true. Right, he said, pointing at her. But I don't know how long I can keep her away, so the sooner you get it fixed the better. Melinda paused, wondering if she should share her dilemma with her father. Jared's already come by. Good. Good. But it might take a while. The electrical needs to be looked at. Hell, that's no good. Your mama might want you to move home until it's all taken care of. You know how she worries. He placed full ketchup bottles on the tables, working around her. Moving home, even temporarily, was not an option. If she had to sleep one night in her childhood bedroom, a room her mama had left intact from her senior year 17 years ago, she'd need at least 10 more years of therapy. Hands down. It was her mama, after all, who set her up to believe she was a princess, and all things ahead of her would be shrouded in glitter and rainbows. Learning the truth had been a hard lesson. I'm opening up, darling, her dad said as he flipped on the neon open sign and turned the locks. Here comes the crew. Without fail, many of the local delivery guys and gals came in for breakfast. Their schedules so predictable, Melinda knew who was on and off by the day of the week, and she found comfort in the regularity. The morning passed quickly, and Melinda got lost in the mechanics of transitioning the diner from breakfast to lunch. Woohoo, baby. The shrill call of her mama's voice put Melinda's instinct to flee at conflict with etiquette. Part of her wanted to duck and commando crawl out of the dining area and into kitchen, and the other part of her wanted to cover her ears and pretend she heard nothing. That trick had worked when she was a kid. Instead, she turned to accept the hug she knew would be coming her way. Mama. She kissed her cheek, using the action to stifle the groan that wanted to escape when she set eyes on her aunt who trailed behind her mama. Aunt Glory. She waited for her mother's older sister to indicate whether she wanted to hug or kiss. One could never be presumptuous. When her aunt presented her cheek, Melinda obliged, pressing a light kiss for fear if she'd press with too much force she'd get the old windbag going. Sweet child, Glory said with a dismissive pat. Melinda, honey. Gloria and I are going to Orlando to do some shopping. You should come with us. Her mother took a seat at a table for four and placed her oversized purse in the chair next to her. I'm working, Mama. She flipped over the coffee cups on the preset table and poured each a cup. You can skip out early, can't you? Her mama bat her large blue eyes, a strategy she'd used most of her life to achieve her goals. Melinda would rather have the worst kind of fungus on each of her shellac nails, rendering her weekly manicures off-limits, than go shopping with them. Not really. Besides, there are things I need to do with the house. Clean up from the fire. Yes, but honey, just throw a rug over it or hang a picture. Out of sight, out of mind. It'll still be waiting for you when you get home, and maybe while we're out you might find the perfect accent piece. To accentuate the fire? Melinda turned to glare at her dad. Downplaying the fire had been his idea after all, and now her mother thought it was something so small and insignificant a picture could cover it up. To help you get over the fire. Something to cheer you up. A baby would cheer her up tremendously, but she kept that thought to herself. Her sunroom miraculously being built by a benevolent do-gooder would be nice, as would Jared finding no further electrical problems. Heck, Jared suddenly falling in love with her would set her right for eternity. A knick-knack would most definitely not cheer her up. I'll think about, she said. She made a mental note to slip away before they were done with their meal, but the diner had a different agenda. Midweek was typically steady, but today, likely due to some event happening in town, the diner was packed. She was trying to concoct an exit strategy since her mother and aunt were nearly finished with their breakfast when Jared came in and stood by the counter. Hey. She searched his face in hopes to ascertain how the conversation might go considering last night's talk. His text this morning asking her to leave a key under the mat had left her with endless questions. If she were the type to waste energy on running endless scenarios, she'd have surely done that. But to Melinda, that was time better spent elsewhere, and the answer would only be known when he told her how he felt. Hey. His smile was slight, but at least he met her gaze. The electrician finished, and I thought we could talk about what he found and some of your options. Okay. I'd rather do it outside of here. That okay? He nodded. If you agree to the idea I have, then we might need to go pick out a door, so that sounds fine with me. Can I grab you anything to eat? He shook his head. Why don't I take you somewhere to grab some food? We can talk about all the options. Okay. She smiled and stepped back, her gaze holding his. There was something new in the way he looked at her, something tender, or perhaps it was something hungry. She wasn't sure. One more step back and Jared continued to watch her. Did all the talk of babies open up his eyes and paint her in a new light? Maybe he was seeing her for the woman she was and not his kid brother's ex-wife, or a flirt, or what she secretly feared, a risk and not marriageable material. She flashed him a quick smile before scanning the diner for her dad. Excuse me. Popping her head into the kitchen, she said, You have everything under control here? Jared says the electrician is done, and we need to talk through some options. I was hoping I could split. I can come back to help with the dinner service. He waved her off. Go take care of it. I have a fishing trip scheduled next week, and if your mama gets her mind set on you moving in, I can see that trip going down like a sinking ship. Thanks, Daddy. She kissed his cheek. But tell your mama you aren't going shopping. Melinda groaned. Do I have to? When her dad raised one brow, she sighed in defeat. Grabbing her purse from under the counter, she pushed through the swinging doors from the kitchen and re-entered the diner. Jared was talking to a guy she recognized as the local pool man. Likely he and Jared did business together, and when her eyes met Jared's, he smiled and winked. Lord, this man. He never stared too long at her chest and always laughed at her jokes, sincerely laughed, not the I want to get in your pants laugh. He always gave her first pick of the fortune cookies when they shared takeout, and refused to let her open a door. Geez, she was crazy about him. She stopped at her mama's table. I have to go with Jared to work out some details about the fire. Sorry. Maybe next time I can go shopping with y'all. Melinda. Mama. I really need to take care of this. Please try to understand. She leaned down and kissed her mother's cheek, then did the same to her aunt. Y'all have a good time. She'd no sooner turned her back and took a step toward Jared when her aunt's voice carried across the diner. Maybe if you unbuttoned one of those top buttons on your shirt and leaned over the counter more, you'd find yourself a man. You wouldn't need to be getting that sperm from the bank and could get yourself in the family way, honestly. Jared rubbed his hand over his head, and she knew he was searching for the right reaction. She spun on her heel. Mama, how could you tell her my business? Oh honey, you know me. I get one glass of wine in me and nothing is off limits. Melinda stared at her aunt, a million biting remarks ready to be spoken, but the challenging look on her aunt's face stopped her. What was the point of a verbal spat with a bitter old woman? Melinda? Jared said from behind her. She turned to leave. Good idea leaving with him, her aunt called from behind her. Maybe the older brother can accomplish what the younger one couldn't. Dignity was the point. She looked around the diner. Some people stared while others looked away, embarrassed either for her or by her. Did it matter? She faced her aunt. Aunt Gloria, I make no apologies for who I am or what I want. I'm no different than most people. Sure, I've been unlucky in love. She gave a short laugh. We can all agree on that, right? But I've never used a man and I certainly won't start now, and what you suggest is you owe Jared an apology. Hey, let's just leave and get something to eat. Jared touched her elbow, his fingers gently pressing in, coaxing her to walk away. She stared at her aunt, daring her to say something more. Yeah? Let's. She turned her back and lifted her chin. She could feel the diner's crowd watching her. With her eyes forward, she allowed Jared to guide her from the diner and to his truck. They drove in silence for about a mile before Melinda pressed the button that lowered the window. With the air cooling both her flushed face and her temper, she tried to gather her wits. Chapter 5. Are you okay? He didn't know what to say. He was reeling from the foreign desire to punch a woman in the mouth. Damn that mean aunt of hers. I don't think I'm hungry. Could you just take me home? Melly, don't let her get to you. She gave him a small smile. I'm not, actually. Just a tad embarrassed that she aired my business and brought you into it. That's all. I prefer to be the one to share my affairs. Let's talk about something else. Tell me about the electrician. Not looking at him once, she continued to stare out the window. The wind lifted and twirled strands of her hair, and without belaboring the decision, he took her hand. It was a good sign when she didn't pull hers away that she was letting him in. He wanted to do more, hold her and reassure her through touch. He wanted to see her rage or swear or do something more than simply stare out the window. Well, I'm sorry to say that the wiring is faulty. There were even signs of a different small fire in your attic. She turned to face him and then closed her eyes and rested her head against the seat. Of course there was. I think that should be your first priority. While he was checking the electricity, I was looking at the back of your house. That wall isn't as damaged as it looks. With a little bit of work, a small expense, and a new door, I can get that up to code. It'll meet my standard of personal safety and look good too. You won't have a sunroom, but you can build that on at any time. Like they did, but better, of course. It still puts off my plans. She didn't even open her eyes. Yeah, maybe. But I think we should go after the inspector for all the cost. He's bonded and there's no way this should have passed inspection. We can even go after the electrician. You'll get this covered and then some. It's a short wait, but then what's the rush? Jared pulled his truck along the curb next to her house and cut the engine. He knew as soon as he'd said the words they'd been the wrong ones to say. Melinda turned her stony expression toward him. What's the rush? She yelled as she unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. She jumped out, turned to look him square in the eye, and slammed the door as hard as she could. He followed her. Melly, he said to her back. She swiveled on her heel and pointed a finger in his face. I make no apologies for who I am. Nor should you. I've made mistakes, she said, tapping her chest. Sure. We all have. Mine, I suppose, are just more fun to talk about and poke fun at. This baby thing will just be something else for them to say about me, but I don't care. I don't care. Melinda. Yeah, sometimes I've been more forward, more open and less coy, but bullshit games like that piss me off. Everyone I've ever hit on has been a consenting adult, and I like sex. I like it a lot. It's especially good when shared with someone you have an emotional connection with. I'm not going to apologize for that either, because I haven't broken the rules. I don't steal husbands. I'm not a cheater. He wasn't sure what she wanted him to say, if anything. But at the mention of sex, his mind had taken a slight deviation, forcing him to rein it back in. But let me tell you what the rush is. The rush is that I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of trying to do everything by the book, hoping people would say something nice about me for a change. But like my daddy says, I can shit in one hand and hope with the other and see which one fills up first. I'm tired of shit. I want a baby. I want a family. I want a house that doesn't catch fire when a light is turned on, and I want a sunroom. She turned back on her heel and stomped up the front porch stairs and into the house. We all want that, Melinda, he said, following her in and slamming the door behind him. Yes, but you can get it anytime you want. Just ask any girl out, and they'll follow you to hell and back. People like you, Jared. They like that you took over your daddy's business. They like that you don't baby Keith and you make him work, which builds his self-esteem. You're a citizen they're proud of. You think I wanted this life? You think I wouldn't want to be out there chasing my dreams like Lance? I never wanted to run a construction company. But ever since we were kids, my dad pounded into us that this was our legacy. Our destiny. Hell, the day I was born, he painted Calhoun and Sons on all the work trucks. But process of elimination left me holding the bag. I wanted to be an architect. Build skyscrapers or colleges. At least it's sort of close, she said, her voice soft. He knew she was trying to find the silver lining, but now he was pissed off too. So if I bring you a puppy and tell you to mother it, that it's sort of close, that'll work for you? That'll fix this insane need to have a child by yourself? Fair enough, she snapped. He followed her into the kitchen and nearly ran into her back when she stopped short. What's that? She pointed to the oversized silly elephant slippers he'd brought over this morning and left sitting on her kitchen table, a pink bow tying them together. I bought you some slippers. I noticed yours were ruined and I couldn't find any like them, so I got these. I figured they might make you smile. You've had a crummy week. She pulled them off the table and hugged them to her chest. With eyes closed, she asked why. Because I want to see you happy. Because I'm family? For the first time, he realized calling her family might not be helping his cause, but if he put it all out there and she rejected him, well, he didn't know what he'd do. Maybe if you were happier, you wouldn't need a baby? Melinda's eyes snapped open. And it starts with slippers? It starts somewhere. I don't understand why you're acting like this. Why you're so resistant. This doesn't affect you. But it affects the man in your life. What man? From where I'm standing, there's a paucity of eligible men. Look around you. There's no man and not one trying be in my life. If I keep waiting, I'll end up like my Aunt Glory. Her face was flushed and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. He stood firm, arms locked across his chest. So you're quitting. You're all done with men. Never mind that you might find someone next week or even tomorrow, you're just going to eliminate the guy now. Why bother when you can go to a bank and get all your needs met? Melinda snapped. Might find someone, she screamed. I've been waiting as patiently as I can. I've been flirting and trying, and again I ask you, what guy? She dropped the slippers, then shoved him in his folded arms, pushing him back on his heels. What guy? I have no one, Jared. It's just me. Her chest heaved with controlled anger, and Jared knew this was the moment. It was time, for lack of a better phrase, to fish or cut bait. He bent close to her before saying, this guy. Me. I'm talking about me. I've been trying to be a part of your life since high school. Trying to show you that not all Calhouns are created equal. Hoping you'd not judge me based on my stupid-ass brother. I think I've been a pretty good friend to you, tried showing you I was trustworthy. Why didn't you say anything? Back then, why didn't you say anything, she whispered. Jared hung his head, staring at his shoe as he gathered his thoughts before returning his gaze to hers. There was not point telling her now that Lance's initial interest had been less than honorable, and all because he'd had a crush on her. I'd already lost you once to my brother. Then again to what's his name. When you returned home, bought this house, I hoped my luck had changed, and then it seemed like the timing was never right. And it's right now, the timing? She took a step toward him. He shrugged and leaned against the wall. I want to have babies with you. It's selfish, but if you think you might being able to like me like that. She wrapped her hands in his t-shirt, then jerked him toward her and planted her lips on his. Touching her left him hungry and wanting more. A lifetime of more. She pressed her body against his, and her arm slid around his neck. He decided to stop wasting time, and with one swift movement she was in his embrace, and he was finally kissing her neck as he had longed to do. To hell with all his fantasies of her. The real experience was far better than he'd ever imagined. Epilogue. 18 months later. Melinda pressed the button on her key fob to open the sliding passenger door on her minivan. Not once had she regretted her decision. Being the practical person she was, the precious cargo waiting for her in the back of the van was proof positive her determination to have a baby was the right thing to do. Are you all ready to get out of those awkward car seats? I bet you are. I bet someone has a stinky diaper. She was pretty sure someone did because the stench on the last mile had been powerful. Melinda released the latch and swung a car seat from its base. She smiled down at her son and tickled his chin before she set him on the grass next to her. Stepping into the van, she reached across, released a second latch, and heaved the seat supporting her daughter up and out of the van. Say whatever about her not losing all her baby weight and how she'd packed it on, but toting 2 car seats with fat twins had made her upper arms buff as hell. The better to slug someone with was what she told people. Not that she had actually hauled off and hit anyone, but flexing them came in handy when people got mouthy. She heard Jared before she saw him. His whistling a jaunty tune told her he was around the corner working. Holding a carrier in each hand, she started toward him. Hey, he said, and tossed a hammer in the air before catching the other end and tucking it in his tool belt. What are you doing here? Working on the sunroom. He pointed to the spot where he'd just hung a bird feeder on her newly built and absolutely gorgeous sunroom. It had far exceeded her expectations. I mean, I thought you had a meeting in Tampa. It was canceled, so I came home to see my family. He stepped close, took both carriers from her, then leaned forward and pressed a slow kiss to her lips. Hi, babe. How was Lorelei's? Fun. She's pregnant again. So is Evie Duke. So it was full of baby talk and good food. Jared smiled and kissed her again. Not everyone can have 2 kids out of the gate like us. They're just trying to keep up. Melinda smiled. We still got 'em beat. Thankfully, it's not a competition. But if this next baby has a twin, then they'll never catch up. Jared's laughter was cut short. What? What next baby? You're talking about the one we might have in a year or so, right? Or if all goes well, 32 more weeks. How? What? Where? Melinda wrapped her arms around his waist and snuggled close. Don't you remember, babe? You were there. I'm not making these babies on my own. I thought you couldn't get pregnant if you were nursing. Apparently you can. Sweet Jesus. We're gonna have to build out the second floor. Put in a bathroom. Melinda laughed and pulled open the door to her new sunroom. Things had sure moved quickly for them, not that she was complaining. She glanced over her shoulder at her husband, who was asking their 6-month-olds what color they wanted their bedrooms, and laughed when he told their daughter he was going to install bars on her windows. Some people had all the luck, and Melinda was glad she was one of them. She swore that day, just as she had every day before, that she'd never take luck for granted. If it hadn't been for a small spark that started a fire, she and Jared might still be waiting for a sign. Afterward. I hope you like this story. Melinda is the mean girl in my book, The Girl He Knows. I liked her so much that I wanted to tell her story. I figured there was more to her than what met the eye. This audiobook was created using AI. I hope the listening experience was enjoyable. About the author. Christy Rose was raised in Central Florida on boiled peanuts and iced tea. Learn more about Christy at christyrose.net.